up, everybody? Welcome to a epic, soon to be epic, logical, plausible, probable stream. First one I've ever done like this. I don't know how many people have actually done streams like this one. It should be fun. Hopefully, maybe we'll turn this into something on a semi-regular basis. We'll see how things progress from here. So this is kind of the culmination of something I started back in December with code argument videos, and it's kind of like the semi-conclusion with the finale of the code challenge that's going to happen tonight to see if anybody was able to successfully crack the code that I put forth a couple weeks ago, and if they can explain their process, and if they can differentiate the alphabet value assignments that they did versus what is happening in the genetic codes that enable life to exist. As you guys are listening in, if you hear crazy noises in your random background, there is an intense, very intense thunderstorm happening outside right now, and I almost postponed because I wasn't sure about the lighting, but apparently the storm is starting to move away from us a little bit, so hopefully that will continue to be okay and we'll lose power and such. Nashville's been having some issues with power outages this past couple weeks, so hopefully nothing new will come out of that. Quick announcements. At long last, everybody's been giving me grief about this, so I finally got around to doing it. I have a Facebook page, so feel free to go and join that. If you want to donate to the show, there's a link to that over to PayPal. And if you want to get some merch, I finally put together some shirts. You can go and check those out. Just have a little fun, poking some puns, and hopefully we'll have a good time and see where things can go from there. If you're an atheist, you probably don't want to go because most of them are either more intelligent design related things or the occasional jab at the atheist community. Now, as those of you who are active here on YouTube are painfully aware, one of the most popular atheist talking points is that the genetic code is not a real code. It just looks like one, reads like one, has an alphabet like one, has extensions like one, is a block code like one, can be translated like one, can be programmed like one, but hey, all of that just needs to be completely dismissed because it's not really a code. And I think just for everybody's entertainment, we'll do a quick jab at how crazy this actually gets.
But it is not a code. It's a chemical. It's deoxyribonucleic acid. It's an acid. I don't understand why you think it's a code. DNA is no more of a code than Diet Coke and regular Coke.
I tell you what, I never run out of entertainment every time I watch that. I just can't believe that somebody would actually make that assertion and do it on camera. It's truly amazing. But when I decided to do the code contest, with all the ridiculous amount of trash talking I've been getting this last couple months, putting money on the line was designed to inspire some of the loudmouths to rise up to the challenge and come put me in my place. After all, there's really only a couple of caveats you have to win the prize, and it shouldn't, because ultimately cracking the code's not that hard. It's alphabet to alphabet. You should be able to figure this out. I didn't put any kind of crazy reverse structure or substitution logic or any of that kind of stuff. I did it very, very straightforward. And I was really hoping for more submissions when people that crack the code. Having a much more fun contest, but well, there's basically nothing. A grand total of 2 people cracked it, or at least 2 people said they cracked it, and only one of them wanted to actually defend it. And that person is Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinell, also known as Creation Myths, an assistant teaching professor at Rutgers University, where he currently teaches biology to freshmen and sophomores by day, and then he comes on YouTube and patrols day and night here on YouTube, attempting to debunk intelligent design, and in general is a rather vocal evolution and atheism activist. So he's going to be joining us later in the stream to explain his process of cracking the code, how he was able to code map alphabet values and ultimately reconstruct the message in English. He will then have to explain the process he conducted and how they was conducted, and if they are the same for the genetic code, if it is a real code or not, and if not, to defend his position. Now, for all of you angry atheists out there who have been whining for the last week about how there's extra factors required to win, let me just show you what has been in the description of the video and pinned in the comments since the contest was announced. Let me pull that up real quick. So that was posted at the same time as the video went up, and then what it actually says here is $500 total prize available with multiple winners, prize split between winners. Winners must come on a live stream and explain their process of cracking the code, how they determine the alphabet value assignments, and how this process is different than value assignments for nucleotide base pair codons and amino acids. So pretty straightforward. Not really sure why people have found that to be so inconceivable or misunderstandable, or how I'm somehow being a jerk by doing that kind of thing. But before we get into things further, I'm also going to give you guys a quick crash course in communication theory and communication information theory and code theory. Actually, quite a few people over the past couple months asked me to get into more detail about the fundamentals of the things that I argue about all the time, and decided this was a good time as any to put together a more formal presentation about the fundamentals, kind of give everybody the 101. I really get into a lot of the crazy details, but the general principles. And I think by the time we're done with all that, you will recognize why I make a lot of the arguments that I do, and why they are so well supported by the established principles of communication and information theory, and then obviously the subsets of code logic and code theory that go into that. Also, there's been a very, very obvious and ongoing confusion amongst people in terms of programming language versus code, and not understanding that the one is subject to the other. And so I'm going to get into a little bit of detail on that. But now let's get back to what I did when I was coming up with the code. So the first thing I did was decide if I was going to use all 26 letters of the English alphabet, or since I was using the genetic code, only use 20 letters and the stop signal. I decided to do the latter. So then the next step was to decide what I wanted to say and if it could be said in only 20 letters. Then I needed to determine how I was going to assign the English letters to codons, and if I was just going to keep was going to use any of them randomly, or if I would keep a very straightforward process and have all the synonymous codons be synonymous with the English alphabet. So let me show you a little what's going on behind the scenes. So, okay, so there you can see I've got I matched up the alphabet to the codon tables, and then was like, I wonder if I should keep these all random or like just normal order, or if I should randomize them. So I decided, hey, let's make it a little bit more fun, and let's randomize it just a little bit. So I actually went and found a scrambler and put all the letters I was going to need into it, scrambled them up, and then came back and reassigned those values to specific codons. Now, while I was doing this, the ongoing denial from a lot of the Evo atheists I was interacting with about the functional specifications of a codon being equal to a letter, I decided to actually create an error and see if we could extrapolate this out in relation to both code principles in general, as well as pragmatics and semantics in terms of interpretation. So what I actually did was, right here you can see it in red. I actually used word this. I did GGT, which actually assigned to the letter E, but in that context, in that word, it was supposed to be a T. So if you put an error in there that could be identified, and interestingly enough, both people who actually made any kind of submission both identified the error. So obviously they were able to determine if there was a alphabet assignment and what had been done. And I just, like I said, I wanted to make sure we understood the realization and the reality of semantics and pragmatics, and interpretation factors that are at the disposal of people who understand a language, but not necessarily Not so easy to do if you don't have the understanding of the rules from the syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic perspective that is, that is required for communication to be executed. Okay, now with all that out of the way, let's take a quick look at Dan's submission and see if he was able to crack the code and decipher the message. So here we go. Only atheist idiots think that codes can create themselves. If you decode this message, then you are good. And Inkboy says, I think it actually reads decode EHIS, E-H-I-S, because of the regulated G or repeated G in the amino acid sequence, but the intent is clear. I find it interesting that he actually was able to recognize the intent of the message. It's very fascinating in relation to coding, that there is the ability, context requirements for understanding whether or not something is correct or not. Well, it looks like he was able to decipher the message and he identified the error in the code, but before Dr. Dan explains to us how he cracked the rather straightforward code puzzle that was posted, I want to make sure those of you watching, and obviously Dr. Dan himself, understands the basics of coding from a communication theory perspective. So let's get into a little bit of a more formal presentation, and again, just kind of giving you guys a little bit of understanding education in relation to what is communication and information theory.
Intelligent agents who begin to learn the fundamentals of code from the day we are born. It is very easy to become completely unaware of the fundamentals that are necessary for any level of information transfer to occur. Whether it be the sound and meaning associated with a single letter, to the writings of Shakespeare or the equations of information theory upon which these ultimately rest. In fact, the fundamental reason for engaging in this contest was to force a review of these principles and see if people who have publicly claimed information theory has no bearing on biology can either recognize their own ignorance or have their refusal to accept the obvious laid bare. So for those of you who have an open mind, who are interested in understanding the basics of communication theory and its application to biological systems, let's have some fun. But first, let's take a quick look at the 4 foundational premises of my code argument, which was the beginning of all this action. I want there to be absolutely no doubt of how my original argument was devised, and make sure no one short of willful ignorance can claim I had no scientific foundation to it by the time we get done today. So, premise 1. All codes require arbitrary values being assigned to representative impulses, signs, or symbols. Premise 2. Code values and syntax must be determined before messages, information, can be encoded, transmitted, and decoded. Premise 3. All codes require a translation mechanism, adapter, key, or process of some kind to exist prior to its translation. Premise 4. Translation of encoded values does not transform one symbol into another. The representative symbols are interpreted to be equal. Now, get ready to receive a crash course in communication theory, and as you do, it will rapidly become clear that, contrary to popular YouTube atheist opinions, my positions are directly supported by the accepted principles of information and communication theory. All 4 of these premises have direct application in relation to the genetic code. As we progress through the evidence which supports the claims being made, I hope your critical thinking skills enable you to rapidly deduce it is valid both logically and scientifically. Now, obviously, communications existed since the dawn of time, and while there have been some attempts prior to Claude Shannon's fundamental work in 1948 to define the rules that govern it, these forays had a variety of holes which led to a plethora of problems in the development of technologies to facilitate communication. Claude Shannon's work created mathematical structure to information theory and the probabilities associated and related to its transfer, in addition to the formulas used to determine the amount of information which could be transmitted through a specific medium or a channel. However, all of this did not determine the application of syntactic structure and semantic meaning to the information, only the underlying principles. While the rules could be applied to syntactic structures, this had nothing to do with formulas to enable measurement of semantics. Instead, these principles enabled the development of communication theory and the application of the logic rules which enabled specified and functional information to be efficiently transmitted. So we now have the, as information theory is being developed, you now are standing upon that and creating the communication theory models. The first one was the Shannon and Weaver model, and it's called the mother of all models, and it was developed by Shannon and Weaver, and is now just referred to as the Shannon-Weaver model. And all other models that have been developed since then have followed the following core principles. All communication has a source, which produces a message. It has a transmitter, which encodes the message. There is a channel for which the signals are adapted for transmission. There is a receiver, which reconstructs the encoded message from a sequence of received signals and decodes it. And finally, an information destination, which processes the information. This is called the standard view of communication. Information source, transmitter, channel, receiver, and destination. Or to get even more basic, encode, message, decode. Now, not long after the Shannon-Weaver model was formulated, in 1954, Wilbur Schramm said, hey, there's a few more things that must be accounted for, and he added that communication can be seen as a process of information transmission governed by 3 levels of semiotic rules. So you have syntactic, which is the formal properties of signs and symbols. You have pragmatic, concerned with the relationships between the signs, expressions, and their users. Semantic, which is the relationships between signs and symbols and what they represent. Now, obviously, there is much more to communication theory than just these things, but I just wanted to cover a few of the foundational root fundamentals of communication theory that Shannon, Weaver, Schramm, and many others have discovered and developed over the past 80 years. And in line with that, there's one more very important factor to account for in communication, and that is noise. Now, noise can take a variety of forms, but in formal communication theory, noise refers to anything which causes interference between the message source and the destination, and it obstructs the process of encoding and decoding information. Noise cannot be thoroughly avoided or eliminated, but it can be controlled or reduced as far as possible. In fact, one of the most important components of all communication systems is the reduction of noise, and one of the primary ways to achieve this is the creation of error correction codes. Now, these codes account for the inevitability of information transfer corruption that is caused by noise, which enables a communication system to use the error correction codes and subsystems in a predetermined way to fix problems on the fly. Honestly, it's pretty amazing stuff, and something in modern society that we just completely take for granted, even though every facet of our lives that depends on technology is dependent on these principles. For those of you who have watched any of my debates on abiogenesis and evolution, you've heard different facets of these concepts and how all known codes have required intelligent agency in order to be created. More importantly, I have strongly argued that this reality must be applied to the root necessities of our existence. However, previously I have used the general terms rather than explained the concepts. So what I'm going to get into now is a bit more detailed explanation and expansion on these root concepts and principles. If you take nothing else away from this stream, remember what I am about to discuss is the recognized root of all communication. All languages, whether spoken, written, artificial, natural, and so on, depend on these concepts. They are higher level applications of these coding fundamentals while simultaneously dependent on them. I repeat, everything from Braille, Morse code, ASCII, Unicode, to programming languages like PHP, Java, C#, C++, to human languages like English, Spanish, Russian, or Chinese, all of them are dependent on what you are about to learn. For anyone who claims what I'm about to cover is false, well, go for it. Anyone who works in information theory, telecommunications, or computer hardware systems, or even linguistics would laugh at you for being an ignorant fool if you tried to argue against any of these established concepts. Literally, the very technology enabling this stream is dependent on these principles. To be honest, these are such core tenets of communication. It honestly took me about 6 months on YouTube to realize that modern academic institutions are no longer teaching these concepts, even at the graduate level, except in very specific disciplines. This quite frankly blew my mind, but it also explained why so many evolution and atheism activists are so easily brainwashed by standard talking points. I mean, if we're still arguing about what information actually is, then obviously the principles of information, communication, and coding theory are not understood by the average person. Okay, so now let's get into what is a code and start defining some of these concepts. So in communications and information processing, code is a system of rules to convert information, such as a letter, word, sound, symbol, or impulse, into another form, sometimes shortened or secret, for communication through a communication channel or storage in a storage medium. As mentioned earlier in the overview of the Shannon-Weaver standard view of communication, the process of encoding converts information from a source into symbols for communication or storage. Decoding is the reverse process, converting code symbols back into a form that the recipient can interpret. This probably seems pretty straightforward, but before this code is created and ready to be utilized for communication, how are these symbols delineated? What methods are used to assign the values to each form being used by the code function? And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the good stuff and where things start to get interesting. If you haven't been paying attention, I recommend you do so now because we're about to get into the nuts and bolts. So in information theory and computer science, a code is usually considered an algorithm that uniquely represents symbols from some source alphabet by encoding strings, which may be in some other target alphabet. An extension of the code for representing sequences of symbols over the source alphabet is obtained by concatenating the encoded strings. And since the concept of an alphabet is extremely important, let's quickly expand on that concept. So in formal language theory, a string is defined as a finite sequence of members of an underlying base set. This set is called the alphabet of a string or collection of strings. The members of the set are called symbols and are typically thought of as representing letters, characters, or digits. For example, a common alphabet is 0, 1. That's the binary alphabet. And the binary string is a string drawn from the alphabet 0, 1. And an infinite sequence of letters may be constructed from elements of an alphabet as well. Next, we need to address the source and target alphabets. Now, this is done by code mapping, where you start assigning the equal values to both alphabets. This concept can be visualized like this. So you get C equals A is equal to 0, B is equal to 0, 1, C is equal to 0, 1, 1. Just an example, you can extrapolate that out. The mapping is a code whose source alphabet is the set, so we can hear in this context ABC, and whose target alphabet is another set, in this context 0, 1. Using the extension of the code, the encoded string, which you can see here, can be grouped into code words as 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, and 0, 1, 1. And these in turn can be decoded to the sequence of source symbols, in this context ACABC. Now, a quick pause to expand upon this concept of code mapping, which has multiple elements of significance. One of which is optimization of how values are assigned in order to maximize the efficiency of information transfer. And you want to do this based on the known limits of the channel and the known probabilities of a specific packet of information that will be sent and which one's going to be sent the most often. This enables an improvement of the speed of transmission, and it maximizes fidelity of the information being sent and raises the overall efficiency of the system. So let's quickly visualize what this means. Say we have cities A, B, and C. You want to send messages from B to A, so you must set up a channel, and you have a source and a receiver. But if you actually want to send messages, you must decide what syntactic structure will be used to house your message. So for easy example purposes, let's say you're going to use binary as your alphabet, and you're going to report the following states of weather in city B to city A. You determine the states to report are sunny, rainy, cloudy, and foggy. To send the message, I can use something like ASCII to encode each letter of the word, or I can look at creating a label for each state, which means the same thing, but doesn't have to be as large a message to transmit. So let's do that as an example. So here you see on the graphic, sunny is going to be equal to 0, 0, rainy 0, 1, cloudy 1, 0, foggy 1, 1. Now let's assume the probability of the state of each one of those occurring and needing to be sent is 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4 for all of them. So each one of them has an equal probability of needing to be sent. So we'll come back to that in just a second, but now let's look at City C, who also wants to communicate their weather to City A. For them, it's usually one of these states, however, and unlike City B, they have a 1/8 for sunny, 1/8 for rainy, 1/4 for cloudy, and it's going to be windy half the time they send the signal. So as we set up the link, telecommunication link, what are we going to map out, and how are we going to map out the code values for these labels? Should we do, for City C, should we do it the exact same as for City B, or should we try and do something different based on the fact there's different probabilities? So let's try something different. Say for sunny, we're going to do 1110, rainy 110, cloudy 10, windy 0. So the math for this model is going to look something like this. And when you extrapolate out the amount of bits per message you're going to be looking at, here's the formula. Now you'll be looking at 1 7/8 bits per message if we map it out this way. Now let's say I applied the exact same logic, like place aside the same mapping to City B going to City A. In that context, I would then be looking at 2.5 bits per message. That's interesting. Now, obviously, 2.5 is more than 1 7/8, therefore it is more optimal to assign the code values in a way that is optimal. Now, everything I'm showing you guys here is our fundamental concepts in communication theory. However, what is necessary to know prior to mapping out City C? If you want to make it as much efficient as possible, you need to have foreknowledge or be able to project what the probabilities of the signals that need to be sent are. That's how you would modify the mapping that you would do in your overall code base. And in this context, I know that half the time it's going to be extremely windy, and that is a much more likely message that will be sent. Therefore, I'm going to assign the most efficient label to that message because of the known frequency. Now let's go back and look at the original City B to City A mapping that was done. And as you can see now, it would be 2 bits a message if we do it in that mapping rather than try and do the exact same one which we did for City C. So now let's take a look at the comparison between the two and the two different maps. So you've got one that's 2 bits, one that is 1 7/8 bits per message, but both required the foreknowledge to have the more optimal mapping rather than just do blanket value assignments for the messaging that will be taking place. There's actually much more to this concept that I will touch on later, but now let's finish up defining what a code actually is. Again, I'm going to use terms from formal language theory, and the precise mathematical definition of this concept is as follows. Let S and T be 2 finite sets, called the source and target alphabets respectively. A code, as you can see here, is a total function mapping out each symbol from S to a sequence of symbols over T, and the extension of C to a homomorphism of S into T, which naturally maps each sequence of source symbols to a sequence of target symbols, is referred to as its extension. Okay, so in normal English, what that means is code is the total function of a symbol from the source alphabet being mapped into an equivalent symbol of the target alphabet. In order to accomplish this, you must have previously defined the source and target alphabets, must have mapped these symbols to have equal values, and define the rules which govern the encode, transmit, decode process. If you haven't done this, then you don't have a code, period. There is no way around this unless you want to just debunk all accepted principles of information and communication theory. Moreover, and this goes back to one of the core elements of communication theory, the receiver component of the system must have the ability to reconstruct the original message information from the signals being used to transmit it, decode the source alphabet, and translate it into the target alphabet. All this must be executed prior to processing of the received information. Now, as part of that process, you must have a translation mechanism, an adapter, a key, a process of some kind in place that can process both alphabets. Unless you have this accounted for, prior to the sending of a message, you can send all the messages you want, but there can be no processing of the information being sent. This, ladies and gentlemen, is an undisputed concept in communication and information processing. Not only is it just basic common sense, but to be blunt, it requires willful ignorance and significant cognitive retardation to not grasp this. To say otherwise would be like saying you've been locked into an empty room All you hear all day is a foreign language over loudspeakers. You have no dictionary, no videos with subtitles, no picture books with labels, nothing to help you figure out what is being said and how to translate it into English, German, French, or whatever language you understand. You have no Rosetta Stone. It is you in an empty room with the equivalent of random noise pounding your ears. So, in this thought experiment, there is no scenario, at least in my opinion, where any rational person would make the assertion that just given enough time, somehow you would learn that language. At least I hope not. But some will say, you've been receiving these signals all day, every day. So, according to evolutionary signaling theory, given enough time, somehow your hypothetical offspring will learn it. If you think I'm making this up, well, just go Google it. This is exactly what's being pushed as a supposed explanation for how these things have been, how they evolved. I honestly don't know how people make these assertions and get published, but, I digress. Let's move on. Now, earlier I gave you the general overview of the source and target alphabets, but a very important aspect of those finite sets being devised needs to be expanded upon before we get into how all of these concepts directly apply to the genetic code. Now, as the alphabets are created, you can apply different concepts to the symbols being used, but you also need to account for the channel capacity, time for processing, maximizing efficiency, different variations that you might use in the future, and so on. Now, this is where 1-to-1, 3-to-1, 8-to-1, or vice versa, in many cases actually, come into play for the creation of syntactic structure and the overall syntax, rules, and logic. Now, you saw this concept being applied in code mapping of the English alphabet as the source by using combinations of 0 and 1 earlier when we were looking at how to create a target alphabet. Now, from there, by using extensions of the code, the encoded string that you see here can be grouped into code words, again delineated, and these in turn can be decoded into the sequence of source symbols here, A, C, A, B, C. Notice there are two instances of the letter A being interpreted from that string of zeros and ones. Now, how is this being done? Well, in the code mapping step, which was executed to create the target alphabet, that value was specified to be equal to the letter A. You then have a translation mechanism, in this case your computer, which knows how to read the signals which have been assigned to the source alphabet and the target alphabets respectively, and decodes the string, and in this context displays the appropriate symbols. Now here you can see an ASCII code table for the English alphabet. This is a simple original one, using binary symbols to map source to target. Now the original ASCII standard defines different characters within 7 bits, 7 digits that indicate either a 0 or a 1. The 8th bit, which is makes all this equal to 1 full byte, is traditionally used for checking purposes. Now the ASCII-based extended versions, they use an exact bit to extend the available characters to 256. Now, to date, the sign standard has only changed a few times to adapt to new requirements, but there have been extended versions that use an 8th bit so that regional language differences can be displayed. And then changing between the Latin and Arabic alphabets, for example, it's just not practical. So as a result, something that's built upon this Unicode, the Unicode-based character sets like UTF-8 are now widely accepted, and the Unicode can actually accommodate more than 1 million different characters and is also compatible with ASCII, so it encodes the first 128 characters. Now again, this is all because you're able to map out the equivalent characters to each alphabet needed for communication and are able to modify the syntax rules even while using the same core alphabet symbols, in this case 0 and 1, to represent additional characters. However, you still must know each alphabet and enable the receiver component of the communication system to reconstruct the signals and decode the message. So by now, some of you may be thinking, okay, this is all very interesting, thanks for the little crash course, but what the heck does this have to do with biology, genetics, codons, proteins, evolution, abiogenesis, and all the other stuff that you and Evo atheists, argue about on a regular basis? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where things start to get very interesting.
Well, what's up, everybody? Hope y'all enjoyed a little bit of a crash course in what is communication information theory, and hopefully you see a little bit of the principles. And obviously, if you know a little bit about it and understand about genetics, you'll be able to map out the direct comparison to the two. But now we get Dr. Dan is joining us. What's up, Dan? How are you?
Good evening. I'm well. How are you? Other than the thunderstorm that's rolling through.
It's definitely an interesting one. So, is my mic coming through better now? I know people were saying it was a little bit muffled a little while ago.
Sounds okay to me.
Come through, okay. All right. So now, I guess it's your turn, Dan, to tell us how you cracked code. What was your process? What was the methodology by which you went about it? And give a little insight into. I think you told me that it took you about an hour to crack it. So I'm interested to learn what you did. So you can explain it to us.
Yeah. So I could actually show you the Excel sheet if you want, or I could just tell you. Either way. But basically, it's a pretty quick process to describe. So obviously, it's codons. So the first thing to do is translate it to amino acids and just get the one-letter amino acid abbreviations. Once you do that, you get a long sequence, the LCIFTV, blah, 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 blah. You get a long sequence of letters. And what I did next is just code breaking 101 is do a frequency count because the letters are not used in English with equal frequency. So I guessed that it was just a one-to-one cipher. So then do a frequency count, and I tallied up which letters in the code, the amino acid abbreviations, were the most frequent, and the winner by far was G, which had 14 occurrences, and the next was V with 9. Now, E is the most common letter in English, like by far, so I said, okay, G in the code is probably E in the actual sentence. And then I said, T is pretty common, so I'm going to assign T to V in the code, and then I'm just going to plug it in and see if anything emerges. And what I saw was the string VRG in the code appears a bunch of times. So I guessed that was THE because that's a very common string in English writing. And so that gave me R in the amino acid code, giving me the letter H in the actual text. And from there, I was able to get the word atheist. And also there was an instance of that, TH blank T. I figured that was that. And there were a couple places where TH repeated, and that makes sense because that's a common thing. So once I had the word atheist, now I have THE, A, which plug in all the A's, that makes life easier, plus I and S. S is pretty common. And then from there, it was just kind of playing Wheel of Fortune and see what other words jumped out. And once I got, it didn't take all that long. Probably the longest step was actually, doing the frequency count didn't take that long. I just futzed around with it for maybe 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes until I, got two sentences that made sense. And that was it. Yeah, that's the process.
Right on. So is it reasonable to conclude that without your knowledge of the English language and your knowledge of what is a codon from a syntactic perspective do you think you still would have been able to crack it?
The reason I was able to crack it, honestly, is I read a book one time called Battle of the Wits on World War II code breaking. And so I was just like, okay, what did they talk about in that book in terms of how to break a code? And like that's the answer. First thing, frequency count. Second thing, figure out if it's first, is it a one-to-one cipher or is it shifting? I just guessed that it was one-to-one. I had no good reason to think that except it was probably one-to-one. And then second thing was, what did they say to do in that book? Oh, a frequency count, because then you could figure out a couple of letters. And then once you do that, then like I said, you're just filling in the blanks. Once you have the framework of, letters like T, E, A, S, a couple other ones, then it's just fill in the blanks, and it's just what words make sense in the context of what's already there. It wasn't more, there wasn't more sophistication to it than that.
People are saying that audio is not coming through. How about now? Folks in the chat, let me know if audio is coming through better. Got the gain turned up, and I can't really get much closer to my mic. Not sure what's going on there. All right, that's a lot of long years. Okay. All right, yeah, folks in the chat, let me know if you're being able to hear me, and I've adjusted the gain a little bit, so let me know if the audio starts coming through better. Okay, so one of our previous encounters, you and I had a little back and forth, and you basically stated that information communication theory didn't really have any relevance to your understanding of biology and genetics. Do you still hold that position, or
I don't recall ever saying that, but I mean, information theory is clearly relevant to biology. I don't think I would dispute that. Maybe I did, but I don't recall saying that. But I think information theory is relevant to biology. Sure.
Interesting. You said like literally the polar opposite in one of our interactions. So, in relation to the way I use the codons, is there any way it can be interpreted other than using them as a source alphabet?
Is there any other way? Sorry, what was the second half of that? And using them as a.
Could it be interpreted as me using them as anything else in this context? Anything other than the source alphabet?
The source alphabet. So not being well versed in coding stuff and linguistics beyond basically what we all just watched. Sure, yeah, source, yeah, it's a source alphabet. Sure.
Why is everybody not? Have I gone down in volume or gone up? What are you hearing from me?
It's coming through fine for me.
How's everybody telling me they can't hear me in chat?
Someone suggested maybe your source input is wrong. Maybe you're using the webcam mic.
No, I'm not. I've got it set to my Yeti. Other people say they can hear me just fine. Okay, whatever.
I can hear you. For what it's worth, I can hear you pretty much fine. I think it's, I mean, maybe it's low, like on the low side, but I mean, my volume's not even that high and I can hear you fine. So I think it's okay. Here, I can turn my gain down and maybe that'll help. Where is, here we go. Hang on. There, I just turned my gain down. So if you want to crank yours up, that maybe might, can people still hear me?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know what's going on. I can hear you just fine. I wonder if StreamYard's having problems tonight. Okay, so I know you obviously teach my introductory biology classes up there at Rutgers Genetics and such. When you're teaching your students, do you teach them that the genetic code is a literal or a figurative code?
I don't really distinguish, but I certainly talk about the genetic code. That's part of what we do. Yeah. It's hard to teach biology without talking about the genetic code.
Right. So what is your personal position? Is it literal or figurative?
Is it a literal code?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So do you think that all the principles of code mapping, value assignment, semantics, and pragmatics are all necessities in order for genes to be expressed and protein synthesis to occur?
If you want to characterize the reactions that way, sure, yeah. I don't have a problem with that characterization. Like I said, I'm not an expert in linguistics, coding, any of that kind of stuff. But if the experts in the field want to say that it's a code, then sure. I'm happy with that definition.
So you will publicly state that it is literal code, not figurative, not analogy, not simile, not metaphor.
Sure. I've read people over the last week that describe it that way, and they're like experts specifically in this, describing it that way, like biologists. So sure, I'm not in a position to disagree with people who are specialists in this field. If people who are like studying the information of biology and how that works and how it's transmitted, if they say this is a code, it has these components, which many of them do, not all, but many, then I'm inclined to say, yeah, that's right.
Interesting. Okay, so is it? You're a pretty vocal evolutionist slash atheist running around YouTube on stuff, and I've seen you on pretty strong language talk about how the specificity of these things, isn't really a question that has to get addressed. So, do you think
Have I said
that,
what? What have I? Sorry, the
I'm
specificity.
finishing my question. So, in relation to the code that you cracked, do you think that without your knowledge of both the English language, codon alphabet, frequency, and searches and things of that nature, do you think there's any way that without another intelligent agent that does have those knowledge, that the code would ever be cracked?
That the your code, you mean the one that we just went through?
Yeah.
Oh well, yeah. You came up with the code, and then me and one other person decrypted. I guess is that the right word? I don't even know the right words. Is decrypted the right word? We decrypted the code, right? So
No, that's not what I asked. I asked you if there were no other intelligent agents involved, would the code get cracked, or would you sit there?
Well, no. You need like someone that understands English to crack the code.
Right. So in the context of communication theory, you have to have the decoding adapter, key, whatever. You have to have that mechanism in the communication system in order for the code to be decrypted, right?
I think so.
Okay. So
I think for all known codes that we have generated, then I think that's the case.
So do you think there does have to be or does not have to be a decoder for the genetic code?
So I think there does have to be, and that would be the tRNA, the ribosome, depending on how you define the parts, right? Those would be the decoders.
Right, but how do you have to have knowledge of both alphabets in order for a decoder to work? So how do you account for that if you don't think that it's possible that without knowledge of the English language that you could ever be able to decrypt the one that you did? How would you be able to decrypt one if you don't have a mechanism that knows both sides of the alphabet, both the source and the target alphabet in question for communication?
Right. Well, so specifically for the genetic code, there are 4 hypotheses that I'm aware of in terms of how that code would have originated. One of them is I think it's called the frozen accident hypothesis, which was basically like chemicals associated more or less arbitrarily. And then once a specific set of nucleotides was associated with a specific amino acid, it kind of got stuck that way. The other 3 hypotheses are kind of impose constraints and also, not sure what the right word is, because again, this is not specifically my field, but they basically refine that hypothesis to narrow the range of possibilities that are useful in a like not even a biological context, but just a chemical context in terms of the reactions. So one of them has to do with the metabolic and synthesis pathways for amino acids. One of them has to do with minimizing errors. So you get, like, for example, the wobble effect, where the third base in a codon oftentimes doesn't matter. And then the third one, what's the third? I have the paper around here. I have it open. Let me just look, and I can tell you the third one instead of trying to remember it. Here we go. And the third one is, what's the one I missed? It's there's the there's the affinity one. There's the optimization. Well, it's just affinity. It's that there's differences in affinity between different short nucleotides and specific amino acids. So you end up with certain combinations that go together and certain combinations that don't. So you've got differences in affinity, you've got optimizing for minimizing errors, and you've got relationships based on metabolic and synthetic pathways. And those are kind of the 3 hypotheses that can be layered on top of the, I don't know, it's arbitrary hypothesis.
Okay, so which one do you lean towards?
I don't have a preference among the 3. Actually, let me say, I think that the optimization one has merit, specifically because one thing I am very well versed in is cytosine. And the reason we have thymine in DNA instead of uracil is basically because thymine is unstable, or cytosine rather is unstable, and having thymine allows you to correct errors in cytosine when it mutates, because when it mutates, the thing it spontaneously degrades into is uracil. So if you use uracil, then like hard to tell which one's supposed to be uracil and which one's a cytosine. But if you use thymine, then anytime you see uracil in your DNA, you could just flip it back to cytosine. So that mechanism is similar to what you would get with the optimization hypothesis, where you would have combinations that minimize the effects of mutations. And I will say there is actually evidence for that in, for example, the way single-stranded DNA viruses evolve their codon bias. They tend to favor codons that have thymine in the third position, and the reason for that is that's basically you have cytosine in the third position, and it mutates, and you could tolerate the thymine there, whereas in the first or second codon position, that's likely to be a non-synonymous change when the cytosine mutates, and then that can cause a problem. So you actually see the effects of that in the signature, and for that reason, they prefer certain sets of codons over others. And I use prefer, they're not literal, they're viruses, they're not thinking, but they overuse certain codons for that reason.
So you don't think there? So I guess the real question I have is, if there isn't, if it is ultimately arbitrary and you cannot rely on chemistry, deterministic chemistry to account for it, then how do you account for the arbitrary value assignment if it is arbitrary?
So the first thing is I don't think it's arbitrary. I think it's a mixture of probabilistic processes and some biases. So I don't think arbitrary is the right.
But the biases vary based on organism types. You can't really go down that rabbit hole. That's a non-starter if they vary based on specific organisms.
I wasn't referring to like extant differences in codon usage. I meant initially. In whatever scenario for the origin one is going to propose, there's going to be biases in there. And even for the frozen accident hypothesis, no one thinks it's literally equal probability of any amino acid associating with any codon. There's going to be biases built into that system.
Well, I think there's quite a few people who disagree with the with that statement, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, so
I think I just will say you're absolutely right about that. Yes, I think people do. You will find people that think things will be essentially equally probable at that early stage. It's definitely a minority opinion, though, just based on the chemistry. Different types of amino acids, for example, are going to be a lot less likely to interact with other ones, and also less likely to interact with certain nucleic acid sequences, just based on whether they're hydrophobic or hydrophilic or how big the R chain is. You're going to have differences.
Right, but the amino acid is not interacting with the codon anticodon.
Well, based on the shape of the tRNA molecule, you get some interactions across the molecule. It depends on the specifics. Plus, if there's going to be stabilizing polypeptides that are going to interact with both sides of the molecule, that's going to affect it too.
I'm pretty sure it's well established that there is not a chemical interaction between the codon and the amino acid.
Between the codon and the amino acid? No, because the codon is an mRNA. It would be the anticodon on the tRNA. Right. And the way the tRNA folds is basically L-shaped.
Right. Well, I'm aware of that, but with the hinge of the tRNA and the way that the fold happens, there is no chemical interaction between codon, anticodon, and amino acid. Like, it's a recognized component of why
not in the structure, correct?
Right. So if there is no chemical interaction, then there is no chemical interaction, right?
Well, I'm talking about when they form. So the reactions that lead to them, because you have a protein called an amino acyl tRNA synthetase,
right,
and it has to fit both the anticodon and the amino acid. So like and that protein structure is very specific, and certain combinations of active sites are not compatible with each other.
There's specific enzymes that are required for like every single one of these things to happen. So it's not random; they're hyperspecific, right?
Yeah.
So if they're hyperspecific to each individual one, how is anything that is arbitrary remotely plausible?
I don't think it was entirely arbitrary.
Okay, well then, if you don't have so you don't think it's arbitrary, but then do you think that there has to be prior information set, a prior code set, in order to account for all of these components that are necessary in order for the communication system to be in place?
I mean, obviously, no. I don't think there needed to be any prior information there.
Okay, so in relation to communication, in every other context, you do have to have all these things in place. You're saying for the most fundamental components of life that somehow we can just suspend all of those components in order for life to exist. Is that your position?
I wouldn't say for this aspect exclusively, because there are lots of aspects of communication that life uses that I don't think need a designer or some pre-existing framework to work. I mean,
Well,
you could
I'm
make the
not
same.
talking about, I haven't said the word designer. I'm talking specifically about the fundamental components and the mechanisms that are necessary for the communication to happen. So are we in agreement that there is communication in the literal sense occurring from source to target alphabet?
As long as the communication does not require a conscious entity, then yes, I'm
Well,
happy to agree with that.
does your computer require a conscious entity to be able to translate source to target?
No,
Does it require
the computer itself doesn't.
does it require a mechanism in order to that knows both alphabets in order to do the translation?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so if it doesn't know both alphabets, can it do the translation?
Probably not. But I'm not a
Okay,
computer
so
scientist, so I couldn't tell you for sure.
okay, so then how does the translation happen in life if you don't have the translation mechanism that knows both alphabets? Like if neither,
Like, how
okay,
does
here's my point. If the mapping has not occurred, how do you enable communication if there has been no mapping of source to target?
if I under so I mean the answer is that it evolved. Like that's the answer.
So you think that alphabet assignments can just happen, but you earlier you said you didn't think if there wasn't an intelligent agent in the context of what I mapped out,
Mhm.
that it never would have happened, right?
Yeah.
So it never would have happened except in the instance where there is no intelligent agents, then it can't happen. Is that your position?
It can happen for human created codes because they're human created, but it can happen in a biological context because there's biological evolution that replaces the processes that humans use to make the codes. Yeah.
So do all of the same principles apply to biology and every other type of code? Or is it your position there's an entirely different hypothetical scenario of communication theory that only applies to biological systems?
I think the codes all work the same way. I think the disagreement would be with the origin of those codes, where for a human created language, code, whatever you want to call it, you need both a person or a group of people to develop the code and also a group of recipients that are able to understand it. But for biological systems, you don't need those conscious entities doing either of those things because you have evolutionary processes.
Never say anything about consciousness. We're talking about the physical mechanisms that are necessary for the translation. Like if you're talking about Morse code and you're sending an electrical impulse or a flash of light to a mechanical device, is the mechanical device conscious?
Is the mechanical device conscious? No.
Okay, so then what's your point about consciousness in relation to the ability to interpret, to encode, transmit, decode, reconstruct a message from source alphabet to target alphabet? Like, how do you come to that conclusion that we have all sorts of instances where a conscious entity is not required for that part if the device has all that knowledge? So how did all that knowledge form?
How did all the knowledge form?
Yeah,
Through
how did the sequence structure that is necessary in order to create a translation mechanism which knows both alphabets, like it can interpret both alphabets? How is that a remotely plausible scenario if, per your own admission, that is not plausible in other scenarios?
Because this scenario is governed by evolutionary processes, which, like, you writing a code is not. So you have a different set of processes.
So are you now stating that the genetic code is not a literal code?
No, it is a code.
So are you saying that all the rules that apply to every other type of code do not apply to the genetic code?
I'd say they don't apply to biological systems because every other type of code is generated by a some kind of conscious entity that intends to generate that code, which is not the case for biological systems.
Can you prove that?
I mean, to get to the point, I think what you're making is an irreducible complexity argument, right? You need to have components X, Y, and Z all at the same time in order to have the system. Therefore, how could you make the system? That's what it sounds like.
Are you suggesting that the semantic value assignment for a codon that I used in the code that you grabbed, is there anything physical about, is it material? Is the semantic value assignment material or immaterial?
I think it's immaterial.
Okay.
Is that the right answer? I think it's immaterial, right?
Now, the syntactic structure could be physical, right?
The syntactic structure can be physical. Like I said, I'm not an expert in this. I've literally read a book about code breaking in World War II, and that's how I solved your code. So is the syntactic structure, can it be physical? You tell me, maybe.
Okay, so I guess the direct question is, can the meaning of a value, if it's not physical, then how do you explain the value assignment of the alphabet, which you say is an alphabet and it's a literal code? How do you explain the semantic value assignment that is immaterial to a codon?
If it's not, so if I understand you, are we talking about your code or the genetic code or codes in general?
No, we're talking about codes in general. Right now we're talking specifically about the genetic code.
We're talking about the genetic code. So how do you assign, basically, how do you assign what each codon means if it's not linked to a physical something?
Correct.
Sorry, I apologize because, again, this is not my field, so these terms are not things that I'm familiar with. That's why I'm just trying to clarify.
I mean, I'm asking a direct question of,
please.
If something does not have a pre-existing value assignment, and there is no conscious entity to assign that value, how does the value get assigned?
I mean, for the genetic code, it's through probability and evolutionary processes.
Okay, so then you're going back to it must be arbitrary then.
No, the genetic code, I don't think those values are assigned arbitrarily. I think there's bias in terms of how those values would have originated.
So if it is arbitrary, where does that put you, if it is arbitrary, in relation to whether or not it is the rational conclusion that it's not plausible to have happened without a direction?
So I just want to be clear. So I said it's not arbitrary. And now the question is, if it was arbitrary,
correct,
how would that happen? So I think then it goes to just the frozen accident hypothesis where it's approximately unbiased and it's just kind of whatever associations formed randomly initially are kind of got locked in place because that's what things had. I think that would be the explanation under that scenario. But again, I don't subscribe to that idea because I don't think the assignments for the genetic code are entirely arbitrary. I think there are constraints on them.
Okay. Now, in relation to multi-tiered, multi-layered information being delineated through multiplexing, do you actually think it's plausible for that to be initiated through just undirected evolution?
When you say like multi-tiered and multiplexing, are you talking about like genetic stuff like epigenetics and secondary structure for DNA and like 4D nucleosome, like that kind of stuff?
Right now, I'm talking specifically in relation to the quaternary alphabet that we have in place for genetics. So that enables, actually, rewind. Do you think that synonymous codons are good or bad?
Oh, now we're talking about something I can talk about, synonymous codons. I mean, they don't have a value. Like, they don't have, like, there's no value associated with them. Like, are they good or bad? They exist. Yeah, I don't think they're good or bad. They exist.
So you think there's no important benefit from a coding, communication, information transfer, and overall function of the organism in relation to synonymous codons, just to be clear?
Oh, well, they're certainly functional in a number of ways. So you can use synonymous codons to regulate translation speed. You can use them to mess with parasites, for example. So like the host is going to, again, I'm personifying it, but the host might try to use different codons than the virus. You'd expect a virus to at the same time kind of chase the host codon usage so it matches the host translation machinery better. It's so, I mean, there's value towards that. Plus, there's the redundancy where you can tolerate errors at the synonymous site, usually the third site in a codon. And also, there's thinking that if you look at the stop codons, they don't include cytosine for a very good reason. And neither does the start codon. And there's good reason for that. It's because cytosine is unstable. So it's likely that those important codons, the ones that like give you really important signals like start and stop, it's likely that those are the result of adaptation to sequences that are less likely to experience spontaneous mutations. So I think there is value in the like. There's a reason there's redundancy in the code. That's a beneficial trait to have. So hypothetically, if the early Earth situation, if you had multiple potential genetic codes, the one that had redundancy would have won out. Like that would be a more robust, stable code. So organisms that use that would have an advantage versus organisms that don't use a redundant code or a robust code.
Okay, so are you suggesting that, I guess goes back to my point I was making about multiplexing, are you suggesting that that's reasonable to occur without an intelligent agent being involved?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you think that dual semantic meaning to a word could actually be initiated without there being an actor involved?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So if I'm understanding you correctly, you think that both the Latin alphabet, the grammar, and the words, and the semantic value to the words, and the pragmatic interpretations that can be initiated, you think that is all plausible to occur without intelligent agent? Because that's what you're saying.
Latin language, no, because again, that's a human language. That's not a biological system.
I'm talking like the symbols.
No, because humans made those.
Okay, so what is the difference? So are you agreeing, I'm trying to make sure you delineate this, because earlier you stated that the codons and the amino acids are alphabets. Are they or are they not?
They are. They're biological systems. So they originate via a different set of processes from human alphabets. That's the distinction you're asking for.
Okay. So you're telling me that things that operate in two different domains, they create themselves.
I would not use the phrase create themselves. I would say originate via evolutionary processes, because create themselves implies that there's a goal or an agency for the things themselves, and that's not the case.
Well, doesn't your entire model rely on replication?
Rely on replication, you said?
Yeah.
Would I say the whole model relies on replication? I mean, you need a replicator, so sure. Yeah, sure. The whole model relies on replication. Sure.
Okay, so going back to my point, if your entire model requires replication to be the foundational component, then how are you going to claim that the alphabet didn't create itself?
How am I going to claim that the alphabet didn't create itself? Because we know how evolution works, and we have evolutionary processes that explain how these things originated. That's how I'm going to make that claim.
We have an explanation for how they created themselves? Do tell.
Well, again, with the caveat that I don't like the phrase created themselves, I earlier gave you 4 hypotheses that people use. So, I mean, yeah, we have ideas of how this works.
So if you're going back to frozen accidents, if the replication isn't already happening, are you saying that they all just somehow the sequences and the necessary sequences all just manage to form themselves in the correct location?
So I think, again, quibble with the word necessary sequences, because...
The reason I'm saying this is because biomechanical, biometabolic and stereochemical, that's not even what the plausible.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to understand where you're going with this, because I think it's not that there's one necessary sequence. Like there's not one original replicator that would have started things. It's you have a whole, out of all the possible sequences that could have originated. I mean, now we're just talking about abiogenesis, right? Out of all the possible, all the gin joints in all the world, right? There's multiple viable options for what those replicators could have looked like. There's lots of hypotheses over what those replicators were and the environments in which they're formed. And we don't know what the answer is. But you're asking, like, do I have a reason to think that there's an evolutionary explanation for that stuff? I mean, the answer is yes. There's a number of hypotheses that have varying levels of support. Yeah.
So
that's
basically, if the experimental evidence comes back and states that it is arbitrary, then you're just going to go with frozen accident. Is that fair?
I mean, again, I don't think it's arbitrary, so I don't think frozen accident is a good explanation. But I mean, it's an explanation, and some people subscribe to it.
Okay. So, again, to clarify, do you think, is it your formal position as a PhD who literally teaches biology, is it your position that the alphabets are literal or figurative?
I think we did this already. I think I said they're literal.
Right, but you've also tried to dodge.
No, I'm really not.
Okay, so are they the equivalent? So you did when I asked you about the Latin alphabet grading them. So it's shapes. So are you suggesting that shapes that can equal something else they're not interacting with, are you suggesting that those things and the semantic values can be assigned without external action? Is that remotely plausible in any other context other than your position that can happen in biological systems? Is that remotely plausible in any other scenario?
Is there any other scenario where you can have shapes, like just shapes, right? Lines on paper, for example, or on a screen, assigned to to have alphabet values outside of a biological system? I don't think so, because you need like someone to make the shapes, right? Like you need someone to draw the shapes on the paper.
Right. So are codons and amino acids three-dimensional shapes?
Yes.
Okay, so if they don't interact with each other in a physical sense, and it requires another three-dimensional shape to be the translation mechanism, are you actually suggesting that that is a more plausible scenario to have occurred, where you have three-dimensional shapes which require 3D scaffolding, which from a security perspective and a mapping standpoint creates whole new levels of complexity to the equations? You think that's more plausible to have occurred through undirected process?
Yes.
Okay, so and then if there's multiple layers of semantic meaning to the shape that is immaterial information, you also claim that is reasonable to be assigned just random.
I don't think random, but we'll say undirected, probabilistic, whatever word you want to use. But I don't think it's all equally likely, and sometimes random carries the implication that it's all equally likely, which I don't think is the case. But with that caveat aside, the answer is yes.
Okay. So if evolutionary algorithms, genetic algorithms and such were shown to have significant issues with a plateau problem, do you actually think that would be plausible that this code could somehow start simple and then turn into what it is now?
When you say plateau, just to clarify, and the answer is yes to your question, but I just want to make sure I understand what you mean by plateau problem. You mean like in a fitness landscape, how you have local maxima that are distinct from the absolute maxima. So if you get trapped on a local peak, you can't evolve to the absolute. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, sort of. What I'm specifically stating is that the real reality is that the plateaus happen on a you have a bunch of hypotheticals when you actually go to try and apply the simulations they don't actually have outside of small level optimizations. And so this is a major problem. So my point is that if you have and this is in the context of having a more robust code in order to run the simulation. So are you suggesting when you have one that has less functional capacity, it is more likely that the more complex things will be able to evolve when you have less capacity, when we know beyond doubt that the more robust one that has greater capacity runs into crazy barriers that forbid these things from occurring.
So again, I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but I'm going to try to answer. And once I finish, which it's not a long answer, but once I finish, if I didn't understand the question, tell me and I can ask for clarification. But so two things. One, I think, and again, I'm not sure I completely understood that question, but I think what you're getting at is that a more complex code is in some ways going to be more constrained because you have nothing. Then I don't know what you're talking about then. Sorry, I don't understand.
It's the literal reciprocal. The more robust code has a greater, like with a, okay, so one of the supposed hypotheses.
Can you just define robust in this context for me?
Greater potential commands, if you will, that can be executed.
Okay, so that's where, sorry, can I just say that's where I was missing it, because robust in, like, when you're talking about evolution, robust means resistant to mutations. So like if you have a very flat fitness distribution, it means you're robust because you can tolerate a lot of mutations.
Right. So in the point I'm making is we are now realizing that there are multiple additional layers of information transfer that are necessary in order for extant organisms to live. So if this is true, and there are, in order for this to be possible, you can't just have, a more simplified genetic code. Otherwise, you can't have these functions. And I don't mean just from a central dogma standpoint. I mean from the multi-layered aspect of the information that's being transferred. So if you need the more advanced, the more advanced code base.
Now I see what you're saying.
But the simulations now show that the more advanced one can't make these leaps. You can optimize on a small level, but not a large level. Then if you
now I see what you're saying. Yep.
If you don't have the more advanced code base, and your model depends on it being simpler, and the simpler one is going to have less functional capacity. How is your scenario, which number one requires somehow this all to have occurred, and then two, for value assignments to have happened, and then three, for a more advanced one to have come out of one that doesn't have the capacity that the supposedly more advanced one has? Like, I don't understand how you find that to be remotely plausible.
So I can give you two things. One, just out of curiosity, how long are you planning to go with this? Because at some point I do want to go to bed, and it's almost 10:30 here.
Okay,
but,
so you and I can wrap up right here.
Let me answer that question, and then just yeah. But because I do have a really cool answer for you for at least part of that. And it's so cool. It's so there's a hypothesis of how methylation came about as a regulatory mechanism, and so the idea, to answer your question quickly and directly, is that the original code would have been a more flexible, simpler code, and that allows you to access different, whatever the word is, peaks in my jargon, but different in yours, I think. And then over time, a more complex code evolves from that simpler code. And an example that I'll give you is methylation. There is a hypothesis that methylation evolved as an antiviral defense in early eukaryotes, where you have, or possibly even in prokaryotes, I'm not actually sure. I don't recall off the top of my head. But the idea is that because if you methylate an integrated viral sequence like a prophage or a retroviral insertion, then that causes that region of your chromosome to condense because the methyl groups are hydrophobic. This is, everyone remembers hydrophobic and hydrophilic from intro chemistry. So it condenses up, and that prevents the enzymes from getting in to transcribe that region, in effect inactivating that viral sequence. Now, once you have the enzymes to methylate, to add methyl groups, then you can use that in a regulatory sense. And those enzymes would have existed around when DNA originated because of the cytosine problem that I mentioned earlier.
Hang on. You just said if you have the enzyme. So I'm pretty familiar with methylation, and the histone codes and the variety of things that are going in effect in that context as well on the carrier level. I'm kind of fascinated by those proteins. Are you suggesting that those proteins formed themselves prior to their sequences existing?
Well, so they would have been, you would have had enzymes around during the transition from RNA to DNA. So it's not that there would have been nothing before them, but you had an RNA peptide situation, and then DNA was incorporated later.
So are you talking about the RNAs that shrink themselves?
The RNAs that what?
Are you talking about like artificially synthesized RNA strands that shorten themselves?
No. There's lots of ribozymes that do lots of different things. Some make a complementary strands and then cleave. Some will cleave other things. Some will just grab onto something and change its chemical properties. I mean, you've got ribozymes that do lots of stuff.
No. We're talking about on their own. I mean, all those ones you're referring to are they're existing sequences that are being transcribed, correct?
They're pre-existing sequences that are transcribed. I mean, the extant ones are, yeah.
I'm talking, literally everything that is being observed, you just said explains this. They already exist, correct?
The extant ones, yeah.
Are they just floating around and just magically reproducing themselves, or are they being controlled and regulated in a very specific fashion?
Oh, they're all being controlled and regulated. All extant ribozymes that we know of are coded for by RNA genes that are transcribed but not translated.
Right. That's why I said transcribed, not translated.
Right.
The point I'm making is, so you're saying that in this context, in the real world of what we observe, they require all those things that you're relying on to somehow have executed these functions, to somehow create these enzymes, to then be able to exacerbate this process that you're talking about for all these value assignments. You're saying that those happen by something that we observe requires regulation.
It would have been through various evolutionary processes, and one of the hypotheses for specifically methylation is related to inactivating viral insertions in the genome. Yeah.
So doesn't the virus have to exist first?
I mean, viruses probably have existed for as long as cellular life.
Right.
So
you just said, right. Yeah. Okay. So you have to have cellular life, and you said the virus inserted itself into the genome. So you're suggesting that in order for the value assignments and the methylation, all these things to occur, you have to have a pre-existing genome that the virus can insert itself into. So how did the values get assigned to be able to pull that off?
It's possible I wasn't clear earlier, and I apologize. So what I was giving you an example of is how a simpler code could become a more complex code through evolutionary processes. So you can have a code that does not involve methylation and regulation via epigenetics, and then you have this mechanism involving viral inactivation that facilitates an additional level of methylation. So now instead of having sites that are specifically just for amino acid encoding, you also have target sites for methylation overlapping with that code. And we know that that's the case in the modern genome. So that's an example of how that could happen.
So you're suggesting that a virus that somehow came into existence and is following a code base somehow evolved a code base with somehow created enzymes that don't yet exist, enabling it to somehow make a modification to somehow advance the code base.
No.
That's exactly what you just said.
I don't think the virus was, I didn't mean to imply the virus was doing any of this. The virus is the selective pressure, but the virus isn't like doing methylation or anything.
I didn't suggest that. I've literally been asking you about the enzymes that actually do the methylation. So, right. So where are the enzymes coming from?
Where are they coming from?
Now we're going back to what I just said, which was that somehow these enzymes popped into existence through non-regulated RNAs and ribozymes that somehow came into existence. Correct?
No. So methylation is much.
I'm not talking about methylation. I'm talking about the components that you're saying needed to be in place, right? We agree they have to exist somehow in order for what you're talking about to be executed, correct?
If we're not talking about methylation, then I'm not sure what enzymes you mean, because
I'm talking about enzymes. So I asked you, how did the enzymes get created in order to do the methylation? You stated that somehow ribosome RNAs were able to do it, correct?
No, not necessarily. It would have been.
We literally talked about the regulation aspect. Do all modern ones, everything that we observed, do they require regulation factors? We just talked about this. So are you now retracting everything we just talked about for the last 10 minutes?
I'm doing my best to understand what point you're trying to make, and I'm having a little trouble. So let me see if I have this right. So you asked for an example. The problem is a complex. Let me just see if I can summarize. Just give me a minute here. A complex code is a problem for evolution because it doesn't have the flexibility. Am I understanding that right? But a simple code has more flexibility. But let me please, can I finish before you answer?
How do you come to the conclusion that a simpler code that has less functional capacity, how do you explain that is more more flexible? That makes no sense whatsoever.
John, I'm really doing my best as a non-specialist in this field to ask you questions to clarify so I can answer your questions. It's hard to do that when you interrupt me halfway through what I'm asking. Okay, so let me finish and then tell me if this is a fair summary of the problem that you have presented here. Because if it's not, then my example with methylation is not going to make any sense. But so if I understand it correctly, if you have I'm going to say complex. I don't know what the right word is, but a complex code, a multi-dimensional, a multi-constrained system, right? And DNA, I think we can agree, falls into that category where you've got multiple levels of structure and regulation and yada, yada, yada. We good so far? Just characterizing DNA as a multi-layered regulatory system?
Now, yeah.
Is that fair? Okay.
Now, yes.
So the problem with that system, again, as I'm understanding what you're saying, is that it gets stuck, basically, because you have so many constraints. It evolves to what is essentially a local optimum, but that now prevents it from doing some other thing, right? Reaching some other, if we're talking figuratively, some other fitness peak or some other optimum for some characteristic of it. Is that kind of close to what you're saying?
Okay. So, were you paying attention to the communication theory stuff I was talking about at the beginning?
I watched the whole thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Been here since the start.
Well, it doesn't mean you're paying attention. So when I was showing the ASCII and then the more complex variation charts, and then get into let's talk about Unicode, right? So ASCII, for example, has a 128 character limit based on the structure of the syntax. The genetic code has 64. That's the limit, right? Now, when you change with the Unicode and the UTF-8, for example, you have the ability, by adding just a few extra components to it, you now have the capacity to have over 1 million different characters that can be encoded. So the point I am making is that what you are arguing is that somehow the code base that has a much smaller capacity is more likely to somehow execute more complex functions than the one that already has the capacity to execute the more complex functions and can't. That is what is being argued by the model that's being put forth. Oh, we have something more simple. Does it have the same functional capacity? No. Okay, cool. What do we have to do? Oh, well, we have to do all this complicated stuff. We don't have the capacity to do it. With the more advanced one, I can't do it. But somehow, it's totally reasonable that the one that doesn't have the capacity can.
I think so.
And the point I'm making here is now you're going another layer. Let's go back to the value. That's why I keep going back to the root of all this, which is the value assignment of the alphabets. If we don't even have that answer, and we don't have this answer of the value assignments for the
right. We don't know the answer.
At the root.
Right.
However, we recognize that all of the fundamental requirements for the more complex systems are necessary to exist, but we don't have the functional capacity to execute them. We are now being told by people such as yourself that somehow, through evolutionary process, this is reasonable to evolve.
Yep. And I gave you several hypotheses for the original code. I gave you one with the methylation for how it gets more complex over time. Yeah.
Right. Awesome. Well, let's wrap up this portion of it. I'm going to talk a little stuff and bring you back in, and then while you're off camera, I'm going to come back with a couple options for you. So just stick around, and we'll have you back on here in about 25 minutes.
25 minutes? Geez, John, come on. I got to get to bed at some point.
I'm just 10:30 your time.
I'm just messing with you.
All right, everybody. So now we're going to discuss some of the things that Dan and I were discussing in a little more detail, and kind of dive into some of the different requirements and the recognized positions of what we have to account for in genetics. And I think that anybody who is actually contemplating things in relation to what is the more plausible expectation and outcome of the what was necessary for us to exist. I think you should pay very close attention, because some of the things that I'm about to dive into are very interesting, and I hope for all those you stuck around to this point, you will pay close attention, because there are a lot of things that are very detailed and also address a lot of the standard atheist evolutionary talking points that we hear ad nauseum on YouTube and other places. And then once this is done, everybody stick around, because then we'll be taking care of whether or not Dan wins the prize. So stay tuned, y'all, and here we go.
Without further ado, let's get into how all of this applies to biological systems, why the genetic code is a literal code, and see if this standard atheist talking point can be annihilated once and for all. Now, to do this, rather than just explain this with my own words, I'm going to let the words of experts in the fields of genetics, information theory, computer science, and other relevant fields make the case for me. My objective is simple. First, online atheists attempt to deflect their own ignorance of the subject by accusing me and others of not having the appropriate credentials to be taken seriously, and therefore any argument being made is nothing but a God of the Gaps standard excuse. Second, by the end of this discussion, it is my intent that all who oppose the premise of a literal genetic code being necessary for life to exist must formally debunk the concepts and positions put forth from which my understanding has been developed. For any uninformed or perhaps willfully ignorant evolutionary biologists, biochemists, grad school students, or any other expert in paleontology, primatology, virology, etc., who claim I am ignorant, or that the points I make have no substantiation, well, following this, you will have plenty to work with. Make your claim and let the world know which of these concepts you formally reject, which expert by name you didn't know what they were talking about, and most importantly, provide the proof which negates my position. As a foundation to this, let me quote the words of Hubert Yockey from his seminal work, Information Theory, Evolution, and the Origin of Life. Information, transcription, translation, code, redundancy, synonymous, messenger, editing, and proofreading are all appropriate terms in biology. They take their meaning from information theory and are not synonyms, metaphors, or analogies. Now, we will go deeper into one of his papers here in a few more minutes, but to lead off, I want to substantiate my position that information and communication theory has direct importance to biology, in spite of the fact that it seems many evolutionary biologists operate from the perspective it has no bearing on their field of study. So now, reading from Should Genetics Get an Information Theoretic Education by Gerald Batal. The many successful applications of information theory now provide strong experimental proof of its validity in the field of communications. Although it became the most powerful conceptual tool available in this field, it remains almost unknown outside the communication engineers community. It shaped much of the present way of living, but few people realize this even though everybody makes daily use of its engineering products. That information theory is largely unknown in the biologist community does not mean that the importance of information in the living world is overlooked. An increasing number of biological papers are devoted to many forms of information recording and transfer, and the word information has become ubiquitous in the biological literature. However, it is used most often with a loose meaning. Many biologists seem to ignore that the scientific concept of information generated a science having reached maturity. We believe that no real progress will result from the recognition of the prominent role of information in life phenomenon, unless information theory is integrated into biology, as physics and chemistry have been. Now, it's rather obvious to anyone paying attention that Batal is saying, hey everyone, it is now proven beyond doubt that information theory has direct implications for genetics, even to the same extent as physics and chemistry. However, it seems like many biologists aren't really grasping this or are refusing to do so. Does that sound like any Evo atheist activists here on YouTube? Up next, I'm going to just show you a chart directly from the paper A Binary Representation of the Genetic Code by Louis Nemser. I won't read from it, but I want you to see for yourself that binary code is directly applicable to the genetic code. And this actually lends itself to something I won't discuss in this presentation, but we now have modified existing code such as the Verilog machine code and done a code mapping to genetic code. This and several other coding languages are currently being used to generate genetic programming in biotechnology. It's actually become quite a big deal and is one of the main reasons there is so much recruitment of programmers to go work in biotech. Now, let's continue on, and it's time to get into some more of the details of the genetic code, and I want to underpin something I referenced earlier in relation to the Shannon-Weaver model, and that is the three recognized components of information itself and their rules: syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. These factors in relation to the genetic code are well explained in a 2017 paper titled Two Genetic Codes: Repetitive Syntax for Non-Binding, Non-Coding RNAs, Non-Repetitive Syntax for the DNA Archives by Gunther Witzani. The code without commas consisted of a nucleotide alphabet with 4 characters and their complementary bases storing biological information to be translated into proteins by living cells. Later on, Manfred Egan insisted that this genetic code represents a real language and not just a metaphor. At this time, it was thought that every natural language or code was determined by the rules of its syntax, i.e., how the single characters could be correctly combined into a lineup to build extended sequences of information. The meaning, semantics, of a certain DNA sequence is defined by the protein product as the result of gene expression, transcription, and translation into the amino acid code. The concept of Noam Chomsky of a context-free universal grammar being present in the nucleotide sequences inspired bioinformatics to study what Manfred proposed in the early 1970s. Life is physics and chemistry and information. But in the 80s of the last century, empirical evidence proved the fact that natural languages and codes are determined by a third level of rules besides grammar and semantics, namely pragmatics. Pragmatics represents the level of rules that interconnect the real character users of a natural language or code with its real-life situations. This means the context in which a natural language or code user is interwoven. This became clear with the empirical fact that no natural language speaks itself as no natural code codes itself. In any known case, there are living agents being competent to generate and use a natural language or code. Pragmatics, therefore, represents the context dependence of meaning, which was formerly presumed to depend on the syntax structure of a natural language or code sequence. Epigenetics proved this fact, that it was not the nucleotide syntax alone which defines the final protein product, but the epigenetic markings. Hopefully that was all fairly straightforward and easy to understand, but to reiterate, it is now recognized that syntax, semantics, and pragmatics all exist in the genetic code. It is not possible to define all of these things inside of a code unless the code actually exists. Anyone who says otherwise is either ignorant or desperate to avoid acceptance of reality. However, I want to expand upon this and remove all opportunity for semantic games. One of the points I make on a regular basis is the arbitrary value assignment for alphabets. In case you haven't been paying attention, this exact point is part of the entire code challenge. Moreover, and I cannot stress this enough, the ad nauseum talking point about deterministic physics and chemistry explaining all this has been annihilated. Continued usage of it just showcases willful ignorance or just outright stupidity. So, To remove all doubt upon this, let us now read from a foundational paper by Marcello Barberi. What is code biology? We must face the problem of the reality of the organic codes. Are they real codes? Do they exist in living systems? It is a fact that the genetic code has been universally accepted into modern biology. But let us not be naive about this. What has been accepted is the name of the genetic code, not its ontological reality. More precisely, the genetic code has been accepted under the assumption that its rules were determined by chemistry and do not have the arbitrariness that is necessary in any real code. More precisely, the genetic code has been accepted under the assumption that its rules were determined by chemistry and do not have the arbitrariness that is essential in any real code. The theoretical premise of this assumption is the belief that there cannot be arbitrary rules in nature, and this inevitably implies that the genetic code is a metaphorical entity, not a real code. This idea has a long history, and let us not forget that for many decades it has been the dominant view in molecular biology. The very first model of the genetic code was the stereochemical theory, an idea proposed by George Garneau in 1954, and later reproposed by many other authors, which states that the relationships between codons and amino acids were the result of stereochemical affinities. The second canonical model was the coevolution theory proposed by Wang, according to which the genetic code co-evolved with the biochemical pathways that introduced new amino acids into protein synthesis. Both theories imply that the rules of the genetic code are chemically determined and no arbitrariness exists in them. It has taken a long time and much experimental work to overturn this conclusion, but eventually it has been shown that there is no deterministic link between codons and amino acids because any codon can be associated with any amino acid. This means that the rules of the genetic code do not descend from chemical necessity, and in this sense, they are arbitrary. Today, in other words, we have the experimental evidence that the genetic code is a real code, a code that is compatible with the laws of physics and chemistry, but is not dictated by them. Our problem, therefore, is to take stock of this reality and to account for it. I could stop here, but as clearly stated, my objective is to leave no doubt regarding this topic. So let us now expand upon the concept of code mapping, which was discussed earlier, and the necessity for adapters in relation to translation. So now continuing on from the same paper. A code has been defined as a mapping between the objects of two independent worlds that is implemented by the objects of a third world called adapters. The genetic code, for example, is a mapping between codons and amino acids that is implemented by transfer RNAs. A single transduction code is a mapping between the first and second messengers that is implemented by molecular receptors. The Morse code is a mapping between the letters of the alphabet and groups of dots and dashes that are implemented by neural circuits according to a set of learned rules. The key point is that the engineering codes transform a linear sequence, ABC, into another linear sequence, AAA, BBB, CCC, that belongs to the same alphabet world, whereas the genetic code, for example, transforms the linear sequence of nucleotides into a linear sequence of amino acids that belongs to a different alphabet world. The result is that the genetic code and other organic codes require adapters to create bridges between worlds, whereas no such adapters are required in the engineering codes. Okay, so what does this mean, and why do they make the distinction between codes like Morse, the genetic code, and engineering codes, and why does one type need an adapter and the other one doesn't? They answer these questions in the last two sentences, which further supports my argument, so let's read them again. The key point is that the engineering codes transform a linear sequence, ABC, into another linear sequence, AAA, BBB, CCC, that belongs to the same alphabet world, whereas the genetic code, for example, transforms a linear sequence of nucleotides into a linear sequence of amino acids that belong to a different alphabet world. The result is that the genetic code and other organic codes require adapters to create bridges between two worlds, whereas no such adapters are required in the engineering codes. And now, just to reconfirm the arbitrary component of codes, what is essential in any code is the arbitrariness of its rules, and we may well acknowledge that there are arbitrary rules of correspondence between objects that belong to the same world as well as between objects that belong to two different worlds. All right, moving on, let's get a bit more detailed in relation to the structure of the genetic code. Shannon information, communication systems and messaging, block coding, and its relevance to the genetic code, alphabet extensions, and also why I often use ASCII or Unicode as an example of how all this is applicable. So let's now dive into the 1992 Origin of Life on Earth and Shannon Theory of Communication by Hubert P. Yockey, and just make sure to pay close attention to the non-material aspect of the message versus the measurable information at the very beginning. Like all messages, the life message is non-material but has a measurable information content. Of course, the genetic message, although non-material, must be recorded in matter or energy. A binary alphabet consisting of 0 and 1, each containing 1 bit of information, is used in the source alphabet of computers and in all communication technology. The receiving alphabets in all applications have more than 2 letters. The binary source alphabet must be extended by forming pairs, triplets, quadruplets, and so forth to form receiving alphabets larger than 2. These alphabets are called the first, second, third, and so forth extensions of the primary binary alphabet. These extensions are called a byte. The use of an initiator codon and codons to terminate the sequence, and the realization that the genetic code is a block code like the barcodes discussed above, makes it unnecessary to assume that commas are needed. The source alphabet of the genetic code is the 4 nucleotides of DNA and mRNA. Thus, each nucleotide has a 2-bit byte. The first extension of that quaternary alphabet has 16 letters. That is not sufficient to code the canonical 20 amino acids that are transcribed into protein. Accordingly, nature has gone to the second extension 64-letter alphabet. Thus, the genetic code has a 6-bit byte, usually called a codon. Sometimes a codon is called a word, but this is clearly inappropriate. The codon is a letter in the second extension of the mRNA alphabet. The protein is a word. The genetic code, shown in Table 2, shares a number of properties with the postal ZIP+4 code and the ASCII computer codes. The genetic code is a block code because all codons are triplets. The genetic code is distinct and uniquely decodable because the single methionine codon AUG and sometimes the leucine codons UUG and CUG serve as a starting signal for the protein sequence and perform the same function as the long frame bar at the beginning of the postal message in ZIP+4 code. It is a curious fact, highly relevant to the origin of life, that the genetic code is constructed to confront and solve the problems of communication and recording by the same principles found both in genetic information systems and in modern computer and communication codes. The origin of a rather accurate genetic code is a pons asinorum that must be crossed to pass over the abyss that separates crystallography, high polymer chemistry, and physics from biology. As I mentioned above, there is nothing in the physiochemical world that remotely resembles reactions being determined by sequence and codes between sequences. The existence of a genome and the genetic code divides living organisms from non-living matter. At this point, I would hope the clear distinction between living and non-living matter has been established and that no rational individual will continue to spew the assertion that the genetic code isn't really a code in the literal sense. However, I'm sure some will, so let's proceed on to another discovery discussed in a 2017 paper which expands upon the application of contextual interpretation. So, the case for the genetic code as a triplet of codes. The efficiency of codon translation in vivo is controlled by many factors, including codon context. At a site early in the Salmonella flagellum gene, the effects of translation on replacing codons, THR6 and PRO8 of flagellum with synonymous alternates, produced a 600-fold range in flagellum activity. Synonymous changes in THR6 and LEU9 resulted in a 2-fold range in flagellum activity. The level of flagellum activity produced by any codon arrangement was directly proportional to the degree of in vivo ribosome stalling at synonymous codons. Synonymous codon suppressors that corrected the effect of translation defective synonymous flagellum allele were restricted to 2 codons flanking the translation defect codon. The various codon arrangements had no apparent effects on flagellum mRNA stability or predicted mRNA secondary structures. Our data suggest that efficient mRNA translation is determined by a triplet of triplet genetic code. That is, the efficiency of translating a particular codon is influenced by the nature of the immediate adjacent flanking codons. A model explaining these codon context effects by suggesting that codon recognition by elongation factor-bound aminoacyl tRNA is initiated by hydrogen bond interactions between the first 2 nucleotides of the codon an anticodon, and then is stabilized by base stacking energy over 3 successive codons. The genetic code for life is a triplet base code. It is known that adjacent codons can influence translation of a given code, and that codon pair biases occur throughout nature. We show that mRNA translation at a given codon can be affected by the 2 previous codons. Data presented here support a model in which the evolutionary selection pressure on a single codon is over 5 successive codons, including synonymous codons. This work provides a foundation for the interpretation of how single DNA base changes might affect translation over multiple codons, and should be considered in the characterization of the effects of DNA base changes on human disease. Every time I read through that, it blows my mind to consider the reality that there is a contextual-based interpretation of a message that is being transmitted through a specific sequence of molecules. It seems that just like what we do in our block codes, as touched upon by Hubert Yockey in his paper, context can both influence and in some cases alter the semantics of a message. And what's even more astounding is that people still argue it's more likely that this happened by chance rather than intelligent agency. However, in spite of everything covered so far, on the off chance that there are still people who want to cling to the uninformed atheist talking point that it's not actually code, let's go one additional layer of what is known and is honestly rather mind-blowing, and that is multiplexed codes. Information processing in genetics is an emerging field. An important field of investigation is the estimation of entropy of DNA sequences. The entropy of sequences was essentially used in order to recognize and characterize various regions of DNA sequences. In these studies, DNA is considered as digital data using a quaternary alphabet. This kind of representation implies also some works at the frontier of digital communications. Lots of studies deal with coding and especially error coding schemes. Nevertheless, another key component in communication systems is the source coding. In this paper, we will compare the genetic code with a recent source coding method called multiplexed codes. Now, quick interjection before we dive into the meat of this paper. You notice that they mentioned error coding schemes and how many studies are being conducted on finding the error correction codes. This is something I haven't even touched on in this presentation, but let's just say it is well recognized that without them, it is not remotely plausible for life to exist. Beyond that, we know error correction is executed, but we are just now scratching the surface of what those codes actually are. Now back to the paper. This paper is organized as follows. First, we shall introduce the genetic code. This presentation will focus on some important features of this code: degeneracy, universality. In section 3, we will present a recent source coding method called multiplex codes. We will note some similarities in the construction of multiplex codes with the genetic code. In section 4, we will go further into the comparison between these codes by considering the genetic data of several species study. The multiplex code described in the previous section has numerous similarities for the genetic code. Indeed, code words in genetic code or codons have a fixed length, as in multiplex codes. Moreover, the number of codons, 64, is much greater than the number of source elements, 20 amino acids and the stop signal. Therefore, these source elements can be considered as the high priority source and are associated to subsets of codons called equivalence classes. This feature was previously called the degeneracy of the genetic code. In our introduction of multiplex codes, code words were composed of binary elements. In genetics, the alphabet used is quaternary, A, G, T, C. This difference is not very important from the conceptual point of view, but appears inversely interesting. Indeed, multiplex codes use the inherent redundancy of a fixed-length code to convey a secondary source of information. We can see that first maxima is reached for a quaternary alphabet, such as the one used in the genetic code. According to multiplex code theory, this redundancy can be used to convey information from a secondary source. This remark can be a new argument in favor of what is the optimal size for the genetic alphabet. All the above remarks show that there is a link between multiplex codes and the genetic code. In order to validate this link, we shall now study the equivalence classes in the genetic code. Okay, another quick explanation of the importance of what they are discussing here. Quickly, just real fast, run through your memory bank and think about the number of times you have heard Evo atheists talk about how all of these synonymous codons are clearly evidence against the code being intelligently designed. After all, if there was a designer, it would be simple, right? Why all of these duplicate codons? Well, basically what these guys are saying in their paper actually supports the point I make on a very regular basis, which is, well, first off, until recently, we didn't even know what to look for. And as I stated at the beginning of this paper, as they stated at the beginning of this paper, multiplex coding is a relatively new concept. So the premise of applying it to genetics in terms of understanding didn't exist because humans didn't even know about it yet. We hadn't even thought of it. But hey, turns out it actually is directly applicable. So, man, this kind of secondary piece. If you are one of those people still regurgitating the whole standard talking point of, oh, duplicates, therefore no designer, all you're really doing is showcasing how uninformed you are. Now let's get back to the paper. In this paper, we have presented similarities between the genetic code of living organisms and multiplex codes recently developed for source coding of two sources. Multiplex codes exploit the inherent redundancy of a fixed-length code to convey information from a secondary source. In this way, multiplex codes can reach the compression rate of a variable-length codes for the high-priority source while preventing the problem of desynchronization due to errors in the code words. We have compared the genetic code according to multiplex code theory. In our comparison, we have also taken into account some features of the genetic code, in particular the fact that the genetic code is the same for all species. Our experiments show that the genetic code is almost optimal according to multiplex codes theory. Indeed, our study involves the comparison of compression rates. By construction, multiplex codes aim to minimize the mean description length of the source with high priority. We have pointed out that the genetic code is close to results obtained by multiplex codes concerning the representation of amino acid sequences. Moreover, the redundancy of the representation of the high-priority source with a fixed-length code is used in multiplex codes to convey the information from a second source. We have also shown that the redundancy found within the genetic code is close to the one found with multiplex codes. It appears also that the use of a quaternary alphabet for the genetic code maximizes the amount of secondary information conveyed by code words, which is interesting when considering multiplexed codes theory. Wow, let me read that sentence one more time. It also appears that the use of a quaternary alphabet for the genetic code maximizes the amount of secondary information conveyed by code words, which is interesting when considering multiplexed codes theory. So it turns out that not only is the genetic code 1 in a million just as a standard code, it is also able to maximize the transfer of a secondary layer of information. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you bluntly, how can something be analyzed and found to be optimal when compared to other possible codes, not just for one layer of code, but for a secondary, and not be a code? I mean, honestly, it's getting ridiculous to hear Evo atheists and even some supposedly educated individuals claim that this is not reality, and then it goes even further when they argue that, oh, if it was, why isn't it binary? Binary's better. No, it's not, ladies and gentlemen. We just weren't able to actually utilize binary when we originally developed our computer technology. But let's go on, and now I'm going to read from Survey of Engineering Models for Systems Biology. This is a very fascinating paper, and it's going to get interesting. Systems biology takes a systems engineering approach to characterize biological processes. As such, systems biology necessarily relies on using modeling formalisms to synthesize data into a consistent mathematical framework. In this paper, we show that the cell is an embedded computing system, and as such, several modeling formalisms are appropriate for use in systems biology context. Furthermore, this reveals that the engineering disciplines of computer systems engineering, electrical engineering, and chemical engineering are relevant for development of systems biology models. The cell is an embedded computer system because it has the properties of an embedded computer system architecture. It operates concurrently, with various chemical algorithms and autonomous actors acting in parallel. It is reactive and live because an overly slow response will abort chemical algorithms, possibly resulting in the death of the cell. It is robust because it is capable of adapting to changing conditions. Lastly, the system is heterogeneous in that each protein constitutes a unique type of processing element. We acknowledge that a cell is likely more than an embedded system, but it is certainly not less than an embedded system. Okay, the words you just heard obviously substantiate the points I've made throughout this presentation. For how can something that is an embedded computer system operate without source code? without logic rules, without the freely recognized components necessary for information processing. Now, this reality leads you to a decision fork. Based on the evidence presented, you must either come to the conclusion that it is plausible not only for source code to create itself, but also the hardware. Both of these occurred without any direction from an intelligent agent, or they did not. If you conclude the latter, then you must now ask which intelligent agent is the most plausible to have been responsible. If you conclude the former, you must now think critically and ask yourself a simple question. Is it logical, plausible, and probable that these things come into existence by chance, or is it more rational to conclude that an intelligent agent is necessary for them to exist? If so, then the standard dismissals of you don't know how it was done, therefore it must be by chance, or you don't know, therefore God, become so obviously juvenile and petty that these positions, they become laughable stages of immature ignorance that is on full display. Now, the last thing I'm going to get into here, and to be honest, is just to completely obliterate the joke that evolutionary and genetic algorithms, genetic programming, and evolutionary strategy have become when used as supposed evidence for the case of evolution. So let us quickly read from a 2018 review paper on this exact subject. Our analysis of relevant literature shows that no one has succeeded in evolving non-trivial software from scratch. In other words, the Darwinian algorithm works in theory, but does not work in practice when applied in the domain of software production. The reason we do not evolve software is that the space of working programs is very large and discrete. Although hill-climbing heuristic-based evolutionary computations are excellent at solving many optimization problems, they fail in the domain of non-continuous fitness. This is also the reason we do not evolve complex artificial life or novel engineering designs. Now, they're going to continue on, and throughout this entire paper, they use massive citations to support their positions, and here's just one of them. Genetic algorithms do not scale well with complexity. That is, where the number of elements which are exposed to mutation is large, there is often an exponential increase in search space size. This makes it extremely difficult to use the technique on problems such as designing an engine, a house, or a plane. In order to make such problems tractable to evolutionary search, they must be broken down into the simplest representation possible. Hence, we typically see evolutionary algorithms encoding designs for fan blades instead of engines, building shapes instead of detailed construction plans, and airfoils instead of whole aircraft designs. The second problem of complexity is the issue of how to protect parts that have evolved to represent good solutions from further destructive mutation, particularly when their fitness assessment requires them to combine well with other parts. Wow. Well, I would say that is a rather direct and unavoidable critique of the entire premise of what we call life arising through undirected process, new body plan formation through microevolution, and so on, but I shall save the expansion on that for another day.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will wrap all this up. Some of you were paying attention. I know there's a lot of trash talking going on in the side chat. I hope everybody is actually learned a few things tonight, had a good time with real conversation back and forth. Don't know if Dan was paying attention or was talking trash in the side chat, but it's always interesting having interactions with people with different, dramatically different worldviews. So part of, I want to say thank you, by the way, to everybody who helped me put this extravaganza on, and also want to give a special shout out to the one and only Speed of Pudding, also known as Pudding Brain, who has been insulting me ad nauseum for the last 2 weeks about this whole extravaganza, and for all of the other clown shows that have been talking trash about this. We're here, and if it was something you wanted to engage in, you should have engaged in it. You should have been running around talking a bunch of trash. So, in that context, in relation to, while I disagree with about 99% of what Dan stated, I think I support the positions of why I disagree with him, and think it's completely irrational conclusions to be made. I respect the fact that he actually had the CO Jones to engage in the process. I apparently, for something that I made relatively straightforward to solve, as Dan can attest, I put literally no additional variables in the equation other than one-to-one alphabet assignment. So for all of you talkers who run around claiming that you're super duper smart, either Dr. Dan is just exponentially higher IQ than you guys, or you're a bunch of idiots. So I don't know which one it is. I mean, heck, there's so many software programs out there you can use to crack these things too. I don't know how people did solve. But in line with that, so Dan, in the context of the contest, I will either Venmo you the money or I will donate to one of these charities. It is your choice.
Hit me with the Venmo. I have some ideas lined up for it. So hit me with the Venmo if you don't mind. Do you want me to put the name in the chat here?
Yeah, put your number in the side chat, and
here we go.
Take care of that.
Well, let me see. It's been. Let's see. It is. Just making sure I typed it right because I don't use Venmo that much. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we got it. We got it in there. There you go. You see it.
All right, there's no space and no dash between your two last names?
Correct. Correct.
Oh, I need the last four digits of your phone number.
Oh, the phone number?
Yep. Last four digits of your phone number.
There you go.
All right, so for all of the trash talking doubters and for the clown shows who said they were going to refuse to even partake in it because there was no way, shape, form, or fashion that prize money would get paid out, there would actually be any kind of resolution to this whole deal. Well, Dr. Dan, I assume you should have gotten a notification by now.
I got it right there. Thank you.
Wow. So just this last shout out just for you, Speed. Man, maybe if you regain your mental capacity and faculties to do something other than spew standard talking points and not actually have any kind of substance to your conversations, we could have been having this conversation. Maybe you could have won. But good night. So Dan, thanks for joining us. Appreciate you actually being the only one. As much controversy and conflict you and I have, I actually appreciate the fact that you are the only one of all of these clown shows to show up and actually have the mental and physical fortitude to do it. And ladies and gentlemen, he stayed up past his bedtime. And I know with your latest challenge, you probably have a little bit crazier sleep schedule. So I appreciate you coming on. You have a great night. And folks, I'm going to do a short after show. And then I believe Standing for Truth and Raw Matt, I think they're going to do a late night stream. So everybody have a great night. Keep your eyes peeled for the after show that's going to have to happen here in a few minutes. And we will see what happens next.
Night, everybody. Thanks, John.
All right, folks, as you consider and contemplate and all the different things that make you question, how do you exist? Where do you come from? What is the necessary underlying necessities for your very existence? I hope you will take the time to really think through and analyze and consider not just the few papers that I went through tonight, different concepts they showed forth. I mean, they're well-established principles and the components that continue to be ongoing discoveries that expand the fundamentals of the arguments that I make. That evidence just expands by the day. And I find it very entertaining, all the people who try to avoid all of these things and somehow act like the foundation of my arguments are getting weaker when in reality they're actually getting that much stronger. So everybody, hope you have a great night, and come back again. If you haven't already liked and subscribed, please do so. And ultimately, as we wrap this up, make sure that everything you do and all the conclusions that you reach are ultimately logical, plausible, and probable. Have a great night, y'all, and just keep your eyes peeled. You never know what happens.